Wilson. I'm the CEO and founder of Kate's Tutoring and Educational Services and your co-host for today. Hope you're all doing well. Hope you're enjoying a nice start to your holiday season. And if you have snow where you are, we hope that you're enjoying that too. I'm joined as always by my mentor and friend, Michael Muska, who worked in admissions at Brown, Cornell, and Oberlin, among many other places, and is the founder and director of Relativity College Consulting. Michael, how you doing? All right.
Good, Chris. Yep, good to be here. Let me pull a light over a little bit more.
All right, cool. So as Michael's getting himself situated, just some housekeeping. I'll facilitate the conversation as always. If you have questions, please put them at any point in time in the Q&A panel. We're going to try and get through today's slides pretty quickly because there's just tons of questions that people want to ask. And you can do that by scrolling over the bottom of your screen to the Q&A panel and putting your questions there, not in the chat thread, please, in the Q&A panel, please. Additionally, for the best experience, you may want to set your screen to gallery view. So, Michael and I appear, both at the same time. Also, by going to the top right corner of your browser and selecting gallery, you also may want to click on view options on your Zoom interface. So you can select side-by-side mode. So we'll, both be, side by side one another, as well as side by side with the slides. It's just always a better viewing experience. So today's conversation, hot off the presses, class of 2025 ED, so early decision and early action EA results, what the admissions data means for you, or I should really say what the admissions data mean for you, because data is a plural. So the way that we've organized today's discussion, it's going to be a quick recap of admissions criteria, because that's kind of like the way that we look at it. We want you to have some context on that, as well as some key insights on the results, and we'll be sharing some data. And then what's next? Strategy and advice. In deferred during ED or EA, you're thinking about ED2, what you're thinking about for regular, and then also question and answer session. And if at any point there's a question that comes up that you don't feel comfortable asking in the Q&A panel, it's totally fine. Please feel free to email us at our respective emails, or just to give us a call on our respective numbers. We're always happy to help, and we've been getting more and more questions after webinars the last few weeks, and we've been responding pretty quickly. So you're always welcome to ask us more questions. All right, so recap on the admissions criteria. So what do admissions officers look for when they're evaluating your application? And it's basically these 5 or 6 points. Number one, it's your transcript, right? So not just your grades, but also the rigor of the classes that you have taken in high school over the course of your 4 years. And if you're an international student, if you don't have grades, it's your predictions, whether it's your A level or your IB. But they want to see that you've done well in the most challenging classes that are available to you at your school. So number one is going to be the transcript. Number two is going to be test scores. So SAT, ACT, subject test, AP scores. Obviously this year it's test optional. We'll be talking more about how that's factoring into admissions decisions at the early decision, early action rounds, but traditionally test scores number two. Number three is going to be your resume. So clubs, different sports, work, internships, passion projects, anything that you're doing outside the classroom, whether it's in school or outside of school. 4, recommendations, right? So you get your counselor's recommendation from your school who talks about who you are in the community at your school, right? And then you have 2 teacher recommendations who talk about who you are in the classroom at your school. And then, the essays, so your personal essay for the common application and all the different supplements for each school if they have additional essays, for example, like why this school. And then sort of finally, the interview, can't really get you in, but it can keep you out. Although this year, with respect to COVID, with test optional being a thing at all schools in America, the interview personal engagements have really taken on greater credibility and importance in the process. And so, this is the criteria and the way that Michael and I like to frame it. It's like a fancy dinner party. Your transcripts get you through the door. Your test scores get you a seat at the table. But it's all the personal quality aspects. It's the resume, the recommendations, the essays, the interview. That's what convinces them to ask you to stay for. So if the transcript's not in the right place, you're not going to be invited, right? You can't get through the door. If it is and the test scores aren't there in a traditional year, there's no seat for you, okay? Even if you've done those two pieces and you haven't done enough to distinguish yourself personally, they're not going to ask you to stay. So, Michael, that's the way that you and I talk about it. Anything to add? Am I missing anything about the criteria?
I mean, some of this is going to come up as we progress, but it's interesting to note that a couple of the schools mentioned that on the transcript, it's evident that schools used a different kind of grading last year, and that admissions officers were actually picking up the phone and calling offices, college counseling offices, to find out about senior grades. How are they doing? What kind of progress? Because they're really trying to get the most up-to-date information that they can get. Also on the recommendations, clearly the impact of teacher recommendations is something that's been highlighted by this year's deans of admissions as they're looking at the students that they're considering. So I think that even more so, even though perhaps test scores are slightly less important, we've also noted that schools are saying students with test scores have an advantage. So the things that are in this list are critical right now. What you're doing right now is something that could impact that decision. And for someone that's deferred, what they do in the next couple of months can really impact that decision.
Right, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. So let's move along here, Michael. So we're going to share some key insights from some of the data points. And Michael and I have already been through some of this, and we've been sort of selective and intentional what we're sharing, and different points that we're going to be making based on what we think are the most important data points. So application numbers, it's been a tale of two categories. Harvard, all right, it's really not their ED, but really their early action apps, right, have increased by 57% compared to the class of 2024. If you've been on any of our previous webinars, we had commented that Harvard, per the Boston Globe back in the spring, said that 20%, maybe 21, 22% of their freshman class for 2024 deferred to the class of 2025. And, I had said to Michael that I figured, we might see an increase in applications of around 25%. I was blown away at 57%. I am blown away. And, it's also come up at some other schools as well. I think Yale had 38% increase. I know Brown saw a significant increase. I know Dartmouth saw a significant increase of maybe 38%, but also, nationally, early decision, early applications per the Common App have actually decreased by 8% overall from the class of 2024. So, Mr. Muska, what are you making of all this?
It's very clear, and several deans have said this in the early results, are that students who are interested in the very best schools are taking their shot at them. They're seeing this as a year that perhaps being test optional, if they ever had a chance to get into one of these schools, they think it's the time to put an application in. And unfortunately, by putting all those applications in, that probably decreases their chances because of such huge numbers. But the irony of it is that less competitive schools, and for a student perhaps looking for a merit scholarship or some kind of access to a school that might not be quite at the level as that top 25 school, their numbers are down. And this is a great time to apply to those schools. I've seen students getting significant scholarships at schools that fall into that next 25 to 75 category. And those are the kinds of opportunities for students out there to think about right now.
Yeah, I mean, we may talk about it again in a few minutes, but I had a student who was admitted to University of Vermont. In fact, I had two students admitted to the University of Vermont, admitted to the University of Vermont yesterday. One got a presidential scholarship of $72,000, and the second student got one for $60,000. So, and these are both strong students, both were test optional at their first choice schools. And, that's a significant amount of money,
I had a student that got a full scholarship to Fordham, and what a wonderful opportunity for her. But she still should put her applications into some of the other schools and see what happens at those. But it's nice to know you've got that to fall back on.
Right. So just some final thoughts on this before you get to the next data point, which is, Michael, I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about why Harvard's at 57% and it's a restricted early action school. I thought you had some pretty interesting comments and
Well,
thoughts
it
on.
was interesting. We were talking about this earlier today. Remember, with restricted early action, which Harvard, Yale, Stanford, and Georgetown are using this year. And remember, Princeton does not have early action this year. So you could also get a flood of kids who would have applied to Princeton applying to Harvard or to Yale right now. So that could certainly impact the kind of numbers, because the concept of restricted early action was to spread some of the top kids out so they weren't all applying to all of the same schools at the same time. As a result of Princeton not being in the picture, that certainly would impact the numbers at Harvard or Yale. But I think the question is really, as I just said a minute ago, I think people see this as perhaps one of those years where maybe it could make a difference. I think the reality is, go back to transcripts, go back to test scores, go back to essays and recommendations. If you're a weaker student just thinking you're going to get into Harvard because they're not going to see your test scores, they're getting some bad advice from somebody.
Got it. Also, just for everyone's information, where Michael and I are getting our data from is basically the press release issued by the school or by admissions, or a follow-up article or feature in the school's newspaper. So if you sort of Google, enter school name here, class of 2025, you'll probably get something, okay? And I'll give you some more specific information on some of the points that we're making and why.
Yeah, that's a great example. The Brown Daily Herald today, it's called The Dartmouth, at Dartmouth, both had great articles, and they broke down some of the demographics that we're going to talk about right now in terms of who they took. And we also know that we're doing this presentation with some schools still releasing. A number of schools are announcing their decisions today. And so that can impact them. There's even several schools that are waiting till Monday to release decisions. So that being the case, it's just what we're saying today hopefully gives you kind of a snapshot of what you're going to see at some of these other schools as well too.
Right. So picking up on, what you're saying, here's some information that we got from, Penn and Dartmouth and their publications. So demographic, more diverse than ever. 50% of US-based students of color made up Penn's ED admit pool. 50%. That's significant. And then, addition to that, at Dartmouth, 26% low-income students made up Dartmouth's ED admit pool. Michael, what are you making of this?
I think colleges are particularly highly selective colleges where there is no government input in terms of what they're doing in their decisions, like some state universities. We're seeing a situation where they are making a commitment to diversity, and they're really doing that in terms of approaching their applicant pool and their admissions numbers and status. And I think, sadly, it puts certain students at a disadvantage, because as a university decides who they're going to take, that starts to reduce the number of spaces that are left for everybody else.
The way that I look at this, Michael, I always advise students that I feel, from what I've seen, my opinion, during the early round with this early decision, early action, schools are really building up the character of their class, right? What does that mean? It means that they want to have a wide representation of the world, right? And therefore, they're making sure that they're admitting enough students from Black, Latinx communities, Asian Americans, basically non-white, non-mainstream candidates, if you will. And athletes are in there. There's these schools are socially progressive. They have an agenda. Power to them. And they're using early to really kind of build up the character of their class, knowing they can always kind of fill in during regular because they have all these amazing applicants, right? And I think that, this year, what we're seeing is not any different. I think it's just much more pronounced.
I think, Chris, you used a great line earlier today. They're making sure they're taking students early that they don't want to lose.
Exactly.
They're taking students that are fulfilling certain needs or certain expectations of the school. And with the ED, they lock those kids up. They're not playing games in terms of who they're going to get and who they're not going to get. So I think with ED1, schools are really making a commitment to take students they don't want to lose.
And just to echo a point that you also made earlier, since you did that for me, this idea of institutional needs.
Yep.
There are institutional needs that the school needs to, satisfy, and we see that happening during early. Cool. All right. Well, moving along. So EA versus ED, a clear winner. So Georgetown's restrictive early action admit rate for the class of 2025 is 11%. Over the last 5, 6, 7 years, it's gone from 20 to 17 to 15. It was 15 last year, if I remember correctly, and now it's 11. Michael, what are you making of this trend?
I think what we're seeing, Georgetown, of course, has only early action, restricted early action, and they're making a decision. And Georgetown historically has been famous for the fact that they either take you or they defer you. They don't reject during early. So as a result, they really take the cream of the crop. They take who they really, really want off the very top of their applicant pool, throw everybody else into the regular pool, and then can mix them in with everybody else who applies regular. But I think what's significant in this section here is what we also saw at Tulane and what I expect we'll see at Chicago, which is an ED student will have a huge advantage over an EA student. At Tulane, there are students being taken ED who are clearly weaker than students that they're even denying who are applying early action or certainly deferring early action. So I think that someone has to make that decision. We're going to talk about ED2 in a little bit. But the whole concept is there is no question the schools that have ED are making a commitment to filling their class with the ED applicants. You mentioned before Penn, in terms of 50% of the students were students of color. They also filled 50% of their class, right. So there's not going to be as many spaces left second time around when you start thinking about a school that took 50% of their class and also deferred a number of students from last year who are going to take up some more of those spaces.
And just another sort of point here on EA versus ED, looking at Tulane, I mean, ED wins out over EA all the time, right? I had a student yesterday who was admitted early decision to Brown, but deferred early action at Tulane, right? And you had made the point that Tulane really, really cares about their ED students, less about the EA students. And it's interesting to kind of see that, that kind of play out even with a student who's an Ivy League caliber student.
Yeah, I think Tulane learned their lesson years ago. They switched over to a combination ED-EA program about 5 years ago, and they used to take all these kids EA, and their yield was horrible. Now with ED, they can control their yield. They're getting all these kids that want to come, and they're locking them up. And to them, they're still looking at it as, well, an EA kid, what's the percentage of chance that this kid's going to come? Probably not that high. And so they're probably being much, this kid, the example you just used, they probably looked at him, probably looked at his legacy status, a few other things, what the dad does, and probably made a decision, we're not going to get this kid. Let's defer him. And if he wants to really come, tell us later on you really want to come.
Right. And that's to our point earlier about, is this a candidate that we can afford to lose? On the flip side, is this a candidate we actually believe is going to come? This is a reason too why a lot of really strong students often are not admitted during regular because schools know they're not going to be coming.
Yep.
What happens with BU every single year. BU actually defers, a lot of students, who I tend to work with because they know that they're not going to probably come. They'll defer them, right, at regular, and then if you do the campaign, you want to make yourself, make it known that you're passionate about BU, they might sort of, flip it, but they're not stupid. Yep. They know what your actual goals probably are. So
yeah, I think the BU example is a great example. They have ED, so they can get kids with their ED programs in terms of who they want. BU and George Washington are two schools that are notorious that if you campaign after you've been deferred to tell them you're clearly going to come in regular, they're probably going to take you. Okay, they're going to take you off the wait list because they know that now you're telling them yes, you will come.
All right, so moving along here, impact of deferrals, a bit of a mixed bag. So instead of stats here, what we did was we pulled some quotes for you from some of the publications that we read. So quote, we admitted somewhat fewer than normal because of the number of students taking a gap year. This is from Duke Admissions explaining why the school admitted fewer students in this year's ED round. And interestingly enough, they came out with this article before they actually released the decisions. In fact, the decisions I think are being released like either right now or at 5 o'clock today at Duke. And then over here at Emory, we're not taking down our offers of admission. We're trying to be fair to this current applicant pool. This is the Emory admissions director explaining to the school's policy with regard to deferred class of 2024 students. Michael, what are you making of this?
But the Emory dean then went on to say, we suspect this will impact what we have to do in regular. So what he's saying is, yes, for our ED kids at Emory, you were smart to apply ED to Emory because we're taking who we want to take in early. But when we get to regular, unfortunately, there aren't going to be as many spaces left. And we're going to have to take that into account. Dartmouth has said the same thing. So we're going to start to see some interesting trends in regular of how certain deans have to all of a sudden say the impact of the deferrals plus the number of kids we took early is certainly going to make us more guarded in terms of how many admits we grant during the spring, which means I think we'll see a lot more wait lists in the spring because of that.
Right, and you may recall, and if anyone out there who's interested, this year, Bill Fitzsimmons, who's the Dean of Admissions at Harvard, they actually took fewer people this year, for two reasons. Number one, because they had 21% of their class last year, 349 people deferred this upcoming year. And also he explicitly said he wants to save numbers, spots for people doing regular. So I think Michael's point is really well, taken, which is, every school's dean of admission will have a different perspective on this. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about it in broad strokes here, but it really, it's really important to do your own research and make sure that the schools that are on your list, look at how they're handling, this question of regular. Are they taking people, during the early round and then trying to figure it out during regular, or are they being intentional about actually under admitting it early and then looking at regular? That's really the question.
Dartmouth used a great example that 12% of the class of 2025 are going to be kids from the class of 2024 who deferred. So now all of a sudden, more than 10% of the class's spaces are gone. They've now given away a significant number in ED1. They don't have ED2. So their regular decision is going to be much, much tighter at a place like Dartmouth because they have a much smaller class compared to the other Ivies. Princeton and Dartmouth have the two smallest classes.
So we're going to move on now to test scores. So scores still provide an edge. So 63% of the students who applied ED to Penn submitted test scores. That's to me interesting. More interesting is that 37% who admitted didn't, right? And similarly, 76% of the students who admitted to, okay, here we go, excuse me. So 63% of the students who applied ED to Penn submitted test scores. And then on the other side of it, 76% of the people who were admitted submitted test scores. So therefore, you've got a large number, 24% of the admitted students to the University of Pennsylvania during early who did not submit test scores. Michael, thoughts?
The dean at Emory also said it was very clear that a student who submitted test scores had an advantage in the process. So it's clear that that's something that students have to think about as they send in their next round of applications and start to think about whether or not, if they're in particularly if a student is right in that edge where a score could be an advantage versus not being an advantage, that's giving that score might be important because that might be a little bit of a nudge that might make the difference because you did share that. They also said, I saw this in 3 different releases, that if you came from a certain particular geographic area, I think the dean at Harvard particularly said this, there was an expectation that if you came from New York City, you should have test scores. But if you're applying from some international place where tests were canceled, or states and parts of the country where tests were unavailable, then it's more likely that student could be test optional and not be surprised by the fact that they're test optional. I think a kid applying from New York City without test scores is going to be at a disadvantage at a highly selective school because most schools are going to say, you should have been able to find a place to take a test.
It's interesting too. I was talking about those 2 applicants to UVM who both got in. One had a $72,000 scholarship, one had a $60,000. The $72,000 scholarship student did not send in his test scores. However, the other one for the $60,000 scholarship did. And I wanted to bring that up, also make the point, and you've been kind of great with this guidance, Michael, with some of the other students that we've been working with together, which is how you use your test scores may differ from school to school to school.
Sure. Yep.
Right.
Yep.
So in the UVM case, the student who got the $60,000 scholarship, they used their test scores at UVM, but didn't for their ED school. Their ED school
Yep.
was a disadvantage. So that's all to say too, that doing your research on what schools are looking for in terms of merit scholarship, in terms of your test scores, is really worth your time, because it may bring back some really interesting information, and also some fantastic scholarship money down the road.
I mean, good example. School like Case Western, school like Rochester will have criteria. One of the criteria for kids they consider for test scores is a 30 on the ACT.
Right.
30 on the ACT in an Ivy League school is not going to get anybody excited. So it's really interesting to think about where you're applying and where you might think about submitting that score.
All right. So summary insights here. Schools have priorities, right? They have institutional needs, as Michael Muska says. Who gets in, who gets deferred, who gets rejected, we'll break it down. The people who are getting in are the people that, based on the institution's priorities, the school really cannot afford to let get away. Okay, they're being really intentional. What does that mean? It can mean different things in each context. It might mean there might be a demographic institutional need. There might be a development financial need. There might be an athletic financial need. There might be a geographic need. So again, there's certain talent that they need. And they need to, be really smart with the decisions they make on those students. Who gets deferred? The students who are getting deferred, at least from my perspective, is, the student who maybe had some question marks on their application in terms of academics, say freshman, sophomore year. They've done well junior year. They're doing well senior year, and the school wants to see them continue on that upward trend or upward trajectory academically. I think that also, relates to activities. Maybe some student who, became passionate about a certain set of activities during their junior year. Is that still the case in February of senior year? They want to see that. And also, too, Michael, you can talk more about this in a second. They may want to see how you sort of, match up or compare with some other students who they think will probably be applying from your school, your actual school, during the regular period. And then finally, who gets rejected? People who have items on their application or data points on their application that will not change in 3 months. What does that mean? It means like the 2 C+ in sophomore year in your math class. It might mean something on your permanent record at the school that may not be so flattering. It might be tone in your essay, or attitudes in their essay that maybe indicate a disposition or sensibility that may not be in line with the institution's priorities. Michael, what do you want to add to this?
Yeah, we talked earlier today, and I have one student in particular who I feel so strongly about that I'm disappointed she didn't make it. But I think one of the things that we talked about when I was at Brown was something that we used to refer to as the school group. In other words, in early, for example, you might have 4 or 5 applicants from a particular high school. With regular added into that, you might have 15. And if all of a sudden is one of the 15 who stands out in that group, the university is probably going to feel an obligation. We kind of need to take 1 or 2 of these kids. They may not have felt that obligation early, but they may feel that obligation when it's the combination of who was deferred in early and who was added in regular. And we also discussed, and we don't have to say the school, but there are some schools that have ED who have a very strong feeling that a student's going to come in regular and don't necessarily want to run up their numbers in terms of the percentage of the class they're going to fill in early. So they will take a chance of saying, well, we're going to defer this student because we're pretty sure this kid's going to come when we take them in regular. I told you about a family that I had at Poly Prep. where two of the daughters had that experience. The second time around, it wasn't so shocking, because that's what happened. And the dean of admissions at that particular school admitted to me that they will do that at times so that they don't inflate the early numbers.
Right. So what Michael's saying is, in some ways, if you've demonstrated all this interest and you've applied ED to a school, and maybe you're even a legacy, and they're well aware of who you are and what your interests are and the depth of your interest in the school, they may defer you to the regular pool, because they're pretty sure you're going to come whether they admit you early or regular. It's a pretty interesting kind of scenario, and there's certainly evidence to suggest that that's in fact the case. So what's next? Strategy and advice, and I'll get to the questions. So Michael, what's the ED2 strategy for people in your humble opinion right now? So when I say that, I mean, a couple different scenarios, right? You maybe got rejected at your ED1 school or deferred at your ED1 school, and there's a school there that's got ED2, right? If you've been deferred early decision 1, do you go ED2 at your second school? You probably do if you've been rejected. Thoughts?
As you probably all know, none of the Ivies have ED2, all right? That is by design. But there are some really good schools, Vanderbilt, Chicago, that have ED2, NYU, that have ED2 as possibility.
Hamilton, I mean, there's tons of schools.
Well, I was going to go into that. And then particularly the smaller liberal arts colleges have all kinds of ED2 programs. And part of the reason behind that, people voiced this to me when I was at Brown, Oberlin, Wesleyan, Vassar, Bates were believers that they were very much Hamilton, were very much like Brown in terms of what they did curricularly, and that a student who may not have made it early to Brown, either being rejected in particular, but perhaps even deferred, might decide to go ED2 to one of these schools that is very similar philosophically to Brown in terms of the way that it does things, and be able to know that they've got that advantage at those particular schools. So I think that's one part of the ED2 strategy. Another part of it is, and again, this is a student that I'm working with a little bit right now too, is if you got into a really good EA school or got one of those nice scholarships to Vermont or Fordham, that may reduce the number of reduce the number of schools that you're going to decide to apply to, and perhaps cause you not to do an ED2 application because you want to see what happens at a number of schools instead of just that one school.
Right. And I'm not sure, we haven't spoken about this, Michael, but one of the things that I've been seeing, which I don't remember seeing before, and it goes back to the webinar that we did back in April that we kind of keep coming back to on researching schools online and how important it is to engage with schools virtually and getting on their mailing lists, et cetera. I'm seeing both Miami and Boston College emailing students who have already submitted their application for either early action or for regular decision this week and saying, hey, so-and-so, we understand that you applied to our school early action or regular decision. And we know that other universities have been sending back their decisions. If Miami or Boston College, i.e. this ED2 school, has become your top choice, click this link or email this person to elevate your application to ED2 status, and we'll give you a decision by do it by January 7th, and we'll tell you by February 4th or something like that. So I think it's really interesting too how just again, CRM, client relationship management solutions and technology are now also playing into this and becoming a factor. So regular decision strategy. So Michael, if I have been deferred, right, from early decision 1 or early action, what do I do about regular? If I have been rejected, what do I do about regular?
I think being deferred is probably the one that's more problematic. If you've been deferred, you've got to make a decision whether I'm going to stick with this. One of the things that always peeved me about Georgetown was they deferred everybody. And I wish they had rejected some of the kids so that they would have a clear message that they weren't going to make it. I think nowadays, I would like to think the more selective schools, particularly the Ivies, that have deferred are saying you still have a chance. So the question will be what you then decide to do if you still have a chance in terms of who else you apply to. So I think that a student probably will cast a wide net if they think I still have a chance at getting into my school that I was deferred at, but I still want to apply to a number of schools that would be excellent places for me to think about going. On the flip side of that, however, is if I was rejected at a particular school, to turn around and then apply to a whole bunch of schools that are equally difficult to get into probably is not a great strategy. Take the message that was given to you, ED, from a particular school as perhaps, and I hate to be cruel, but a wake-up call that as you look at your regular decision schools, you make sure you've got some schools in there that you have a very good shot at getting into and not overload with only selective schools.
Yeah, right before this webinar, I was actually talking to a student of mine who was a legacy at a university, applied early decision, and he actually got rejected. And he has a whole sort of team of people helping him, and we're part of that team. And one of the things that was really kind of interesting was that the school counselor encouraged him to submit an essay that didn't exactly present in the best light, at least in my opinion, and it turned out, unfortunately, to be true. But the problem now is that because this student is such a high caliber student, the idea of, well, first of all, he's got to change the essay, right? But secondly, now he's a bit at sea with where else he can apply, because he's also got pretty strict parameters. He doesn't want to be like, more than 4 hours from New York City, right? And it takes 3,000 schools in America and wills it down to say 30, of which he doesn't feel like 15 of them, 20 of them are, going to be a right fit. So, you're right, Michael. I mean, sometimes the wake-up call is something you really have to embrace. And one of those, decisions that you have to do is relate to your school list. You may have to be a bit more open-minded about where you might be able to, find a fit.
Another thing I'd add to that, though, is if you're fortunate to have gotten into a pretty good school, excuse me, early action, it might make you look at your regular decision applications and say, I don't need to apply to all these safeties. Would I go to that school over the school I'm already into? I continue to use the example of the student at Fordham. I've got a full scholarship to Fordham. Why would I apply to any school where I may not get that kind of financial aid and I'm not going to go to over Fordham? So you can start to narrow down your list based on the good things that happened with some of your early action decisions.
Yeah, I had a student in the UK who has just an amazing story, and she's also a first generation student, and she got 2 really great offers at her target schools, and now her safety schools, they've gone away, right?
Right.
She's gotten some merit scholarship, and because of her first gen status, and because of the data that we're seeing, we're actually now thinking about adding a school or two that we wouldn't have even thought about applying to, So the flip side, it also opens up opportunities to maybe add a school or two, a lottery ticket, if you will, to the list. So, all right, cool. So then one more here. All right. So what's the deferral strategy, Michael? So I've been deferred, let's say I've been deferred early decision 1, early decision 2, whatever. And it's still my, top choice school. What do I do?
I always say that the first thing you've got to do is write a love letter. You've got to write a letter to that school and really attest to the fact that even though I'm disappointed, I still want to come to your school, that I will do anything and everything to be able to have that happen. Obviously I would wait till January to write that letter because right now there's all things and they're all going home for the holidays. But in January, I'd write that letter and be able to also say what else may be coming up in the next few months, activities that you mentioned before that continue to build and grow in terms of what they're doing. What else have they picked up? If they're an IB student, that they're done with their extended essay and that not allowed them more time to do particular things right now. Those are the kinds of things to talk about in terms of admissions. I would also say that showing love goes beyond the admissions office. I think it means reaching out to different areas of the school where it could be impactful that the school sees you could be someone that comes in. Someone who's got an incredible record of community service needs to reach out to the people that are in a similar activity at that school. So the school may get excited about, oh, geez, we want this kid. This is a kid that, and that person may go put a good word into admissions. The same thing from an academic point of view. If you're going to go into a particular field, a classics kid, great example, okay? There are classics professors dying to get students. And a kid who's interested in the classics talks to the head of the classics department and convinces or shows them the reason why they would be a good addition. That department head, or that could happen in a science area, could very well go to admissions and say, I've been in touch with this student. I think this kid would be a really good addition for us.
Yeah, going back to the, can we afford to lose this kid? He's like the, he or she or they or the, the one student I've met this year who's really passionate about classics the way that I am. This would be a great addition to our department. Michael, I love what you said about the love letter. I sometimes call it the thank you for deferring me letter.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right. We have to send a message to admissions, thanking them that our application remains under consideration. I personally like to get it drafted before the new year. It certainly has to go in before end of the first week of January when people are back to really kind of show that you're on it. And then again, right, why have you been deferred? Because they want to see more consistency in your academics, activities, et cetera, doing everything that you said. And the only other thing I'll just add to that is it's probably smart to write a follow-up letter in maybe for early February to tell them about all the great progress that you've made. And it goes in, let's say like end of the first week of February, middle of the second week of February, before the February media report goes, which is when your school sends your grades and their update on you.
What's interesting, Chris, is I used to worry about how much is too much. Yeah. And someone at Vanderbilt said to me a couple of years ago that I loved getting emails from this kid every week, as an update in terms of what was going on. It told me that this kid is so excited about perhaps getting a chance to come off the deferral list and be accepted regular, and was accepted. I also would say that I've had people in admissions call me and tell me to have this student back off. I don't need any more emails from this kid. So, you've got to kind of carefully judge how much is too much, and also judge perhaps by the reaction of what you get back from the admissions person. If the admissions person responding all the time to your emails, that's probably a good sign that they appreciate getting them. If you write 2 or 3 and you don't hear back, then that's probably a message that maybe I better back off and not keep sending all these emails.
Wise words. All right, so what can you do? Everything that we said just now kind of boils down to the following. Tell stories of resilience. These are the stories that admissions wants to hear. That seems to be the way that admissions has been going for years, and especially this year. So if you're someone who has regular decision applications to submit maybe an ED2, right? How do you bring that resilience out, right? Because they're, during the early round, again, they're building the character of their class. Students who have faced real challenges. How are you going to fit? How are you going to show how you fit with those people, right? And then next, obviously you have to have the impact, right? And like Michael just said, engage with admissions to demonstrate genuine interest, but don't overdo it. So whether you're applying early decision 1, early decision 2, regular, whether you've been deferred, whether you've been waitlisted in a few months, again, resilience, impact, engaging with admissions, engaging with faculty, and engaging with staff, engage with other people at the university. That's how we demonstrate genuine interest, and that's how we show that we truly do love the school. All right, so Michael, Q&A. We have a number of questions kind of coming in, and I'll start to go through these, and we also have a number of questions that were submitted during our registration period. So a question here from SY, does applying ED change the way that students' regular decision is viewed in any way? So does applying ED change the way that students' regular decision is viewed in any way? So Michael, I'm interpreting that as if I applied ED and I was deferred to regular, how do schools sort of consider or, take that into account?
Yeah, that's how I interpreted the question as well too. And to me, there's no question that a student who did ED and was deferred being equal to a student who applied only to regular, the student who applied ED has an advantage. They've clearly stated to the school, I really want to go to your school. And they've also done the follow-up love letter to reaffirm that as well too. So yes, I would say someone who did ED at a particular school is at an advantage to a comparable student who's only applying regular.
Got it. So question here from Tina in the Q&A panel, Michael, thank you. What are the odds of getting an ED2 from a deferral of EA? Tulane is one that lets you apply ED2 from deferral of EA. So what are the odds of getting an ED2 if you've been deferred EA and choose to elevate your application?
I think it's a great idea. If it's a school you want to go to, you're now giving them that message that I would love to come to your school if you take me. And so I think that it's certainly going to be an advantage to do that. And, our philosophy is anything that can help your situation that you want to take advantage of, you should certainly do that. Yes.
And there's a follow-up question here that relates to what are the statistics of ED2 acceptances from places like Tulane after being deferred from the EA pool? Is it a good idea to apply ED2 after this deferral? I don't personally have the statistics on hand, but you just said it's a good idea to elevate to ED2 if you have the option.
If they give you that opportunity and you want to do it, you should do it.
Got it. So, so anonymous attendees, what are some good underestimated schools that aren't Ivies? What are some good underestimated schools that aren't Ivies?
I'm not sure what the word underestimated means in this context, but I think it means someone that isn't as highly selective. So look at selectivity rates. That's probably a good way to try to determine where you fall into a category. If you're looking at schools, particularly Ivies, when they get into regular, where they're getting down to a 10% admit rate, and in some cases less than that, looking at schools that perhaps have a 30% admit rate means they're still pretty selective schools, but it means that there's a good chance you've got, a third of a chance of getting in there as opposed to 1 in 10 chances of getting into some of these other schools. I mean, there are a lot of great, Lehigh, Lafayette, Rochester, Case West, we can go down the line, but there are many schools, Hamilton, that fall into those categories that are great schools to take the time to look at. You're coming down the amount of time you've got left. Some good schools still are January 15th, but some of these schools are also January 1 admission. So you need to get on top of this right away.
Yeah, so I'll just add some more data points to it. You use 30% acceptance rate as a bit of a break point. I agree. I think as soon as you go above 30%, 31 and above, and between like 60% admit rate, you're in a sweet spot there. And that's usually going to be schools on the US News rankings that are between sort of schools like 40 to say 60 or 40 to say 75. There's usually some nice schools in there to kind of, to investigate, look at their programming. And especially if you're a student that's sort of far away, I think that's something that schools really like. I had this funny data point from a couple of years ago where I sort of tracked, the increases the likelihood of admission based on how far away you live from the school. And you see that a lot, right? Because West Coast schools, private schools in the West Coast who are able to make their own decisions without quotas to the University of California system, they want kids on the East Coast, right? Or maybe in the South.
One of my favorite stories when I was at Brown was getting a call because I was handling Rhode Island admissions that year. And the family said, we just had a baby. We're curious where we should buy a house that will enhance our chances of our child getting into Brown.
Well, I'll full disclosure. I mean, one of the reasons why I loved, moving out of New York up to Maine is because certainly, there's less people up here applying for some of these schools for my kids, but that's a whole conversation for a different day. So Karen, what do you mean by stories of impact? So when I talk about impact, I talk about the way that you're affecting your community, the way that you're getting involved, the way that you're actually improving the lives of other people. This isn't about a kid at the desk. Universities want to admit people who are not just good students, but also good roommates, good community members, great, volunteers for student organizations. They're a part of the entire, the network and the community of this school. So whatever you can do to kind of show that you're someone's going to come in and be additive to the community, that's a story of impact, right?
The story you tell in your essays, the story that your letters of recommendation tell about you are going to be the kinds of things that are going to convince the school the impact that you'll make, just as you may have made impact in the community you're coming from.
Right. So anonymous attendee, are legacy applicants, if not accepted, typically deferred or denied at Ivies?
That's an interesting question. I think a little bit of that is political. There were times when we were at Brown, and I would say that I would not be shocked if it's still the case, but there would be kind of a situation where you might defer a student as a courtesy deferral, as a courtesy situation, that because you want to be able to work with the family a little bit, particularly if this has been a donor family over the years, to kind of soften the blow of what took place. I'm not sure I agree with that, but I understand that schools do that. So, so for particular legacies, it really depends what the story is. I would urge in most cases to have the counselor at the school to call and to find out, is this a genuine deferral for this legacy, or are you being kind to us in terms of this? And I think most schools will be pretty straightforward with the college counselor in terms of answering that question.
And now let's just to add one point to that, in my experience, I've found that if the legacy applicant who has been deferred by the Ivy school is someone who on paper has no holes, right? They have amazing grades, amazing test scores, fantastic resume, by all other accounts is a perfect match for the school or for the college to which they are applying to. I mean, it's going to probably work out. I'm usually optimistic with that.
And it may go back to the situation we said before. Some schools may even defer a legacy, convinced that they're going to come in regular if they take them.
Right, exactly. Especially if you're someone who maybe has such a sort of like, niche or specialized kind of like hook or interest, and that school is one of the few schools in America that does that thing well, right? That's probably an indicator. Do international students, Michael, have the same chance with US residents to get into Ivies?
What we found interesting was the Harvard numbers. The Harvard numbers this year took more international students in early than they have in the previous 5 years. So, so I would have to say that, I also wonder if the international pool is probably a little smaller this year, because there are a lot of kids out there that may not have applied. And so if you're in an admission pool and you're looking at the number of international students, maybe you're a little nervous that you want to get a number of international students and you were kinder to them in early. So I think that could be a reason why at some schools, international students may have fared better this year than they have in previous years.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. The Harvard numbers that Michael's referring to, you can find it in the Gazette article. I think it went from 9.6 last year, admitted early, to 12.2.
Yeah, over 12%, right.
It's a 30% increase. It's a third increase, so it's great.
Yep.
Michael, another question here from the live Q&A before I get into some of the submitted questions. If you are rejected ED for engineering, should you apply to other schools' regular decision, arts and sciences? Thoughts?
I think it goes back to a student who wants to be an engineer. There are so many great engineering programs out there that, for example, if you applied to Cornell Engineering early, which is incredibly selective, and were denied, you're still probably going to get into an RPI or a WPI or a Lehigh, or schools that have great engineering programs. So I wouldn't change your major because of what happened at a particular school. If, however, you start to waver about whether you want to be an engineer, that's a whole different story, in terms of perhaps I'm better off just being a math major. And then I might apply to a particular school of arts and science to be a math major, an econ major, some physics major, which would fall into arts and science and not into the School of Engineering.
What's interesting about the engineering school point that you make, Michael, is that there's fantastic engineering schools out there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you're an engineering student, whether you're looking at like Penn Engineering or even FU at Columbia, you should be looking at schools like like Purdue, which has a phenomenal.
Unfortunately, though, a lot of the deadlines for some of these great engineering schools in the Midwest have gone by. So students needed to be on top of these things. Purdue, Illinois, those deadlines have gone by. So.
Right.
Yeah.
All right, so Michael, I'm going to get over now to some of the submitted questions here. So More test score thoughts in the process. My son has great scores, but feels they will not be taken into consideration as much. What would you say to that, Michael?
It's very clear from what we've been hearing that kids with scores have an advantage. I know that one student that I worked with in particular at Emory, I'm sure his high test scores certainly did not hurt him in the admissions process because he got in early. So I think that scores are still, there are very few schools that are saying we're not looking at scores, period. Okay, that's not the case.
Another live question here, Michael. Is it common that a student rejected by an Ivy ED and accepted by another Ivy on regular? I'll say yes.
Sure.
And there, absolutely. Any more color on that, Michael? Or?
No question about that. I mean, that's why I say a student who's qualified to be an applicant to an Ivy should be able to still cast the net to some other Ivies during the regular process. You need to make sure you're doing, this is for our very, very first presentation, that you're doing self-reflection, looking in the mirror and making sure you were qualified to apply to an Ivy League school, and that the rejection had nothing to do with any of your qualifications, but just that they didn't take as many students in that particular area. But yes, a student who doesn't get in early to one Ivy can certainly get into another Ivy in regular. Yes.
And remember too, like, I know people get all kind of caught up in Ivies, right? But the Ivies are just an athletic conference, right? There are better schools in the Ivies, right? But also within the Ivy League, they are distinct institutions. The kid who thrives at, Columbia is probably the kid who thrives at Brown and vice versa. So this question is interesting because if you got rejected at an Ivy early decision, it also might be possible that it wasn't really a fit. Why were you actually applying to that school? Brand name, right? So another thing to kind of consider, just because you were rejected by that one Ivy League school doesn't mean that you couldn't maybe get into another one or even more if you're a bit more, I'll simply say strategic and informed on what that school does well, what you do well in building that bridge in the application, right? A couple more Q&As here. So Michael, if your SAT score, along with the post-deferral love letter, should a student submit additional recommendations or materials? I'll say this, you have to be careful because there's this phrase that I learned, the thicker the file, the thicker the student.
That's one of my favorite expressions, yes.
I probably learned it from you.
You did learn it from me, yes, okay. But I would say, for example, a student who wants to send a letter, who used junior teachers for their letters of recommendation and wants to send one letter from a senior teacher, particular impacts in an area of study that they want to go into, I think that's a great idea. But to start peppering the admissions office with half a dozen extra letters or extraneous letters from people who they think would impact the decision, the classic House of Representatives, if Joe is anything like his father, you guys are making a mistake not taking him, is the worst kind of letter to have sent right now. But an additional teacher who can talk about how you're thriving academically as a senior in the COVID situation, particularly if the school is teaching remotely, I think that could be a good addition, yes.
Right. A question here about testing. If your SAT score was a 1350, should you not submit it when Ivy League mid scores are higher? I would say probably not, but it depends on the breakout too. I mean, what's a 1350, right? I mean, do you have an 800 in the math and you're applying to an engineering program? I mean, I'll say probably no. Michael, thoughts?
Same idea. 1350 to me is not going to get me excited in Ivy League.
Yep. But it might get you $70,000 at a place like UVM.
You got it.
As a New York City student, is there anything I can do to put myself at an advantage if I don't have the average GPA and test scores from my school? So when you say my school, do you mean like for your high school, or do you mean for the university? I'm going to think that you don't have the average GPA and test scores for the high school. Yeah. So they said yes. So Michael, as a New York City student, is there anything I can do to put myself at an advantage if I don't have the average GPA and test scores from my school?
It's back to the context I mentioned before, is that oftentimes when an admissions person is looking at the applicants from a particular school, it's what we refer to as the school group. And in that situation, it's how do you fall in the school group? Great story I love to tell when I was at Brown was we would have 100 applicants from Phillips Andover in a typical year from Andover to Brown. And I would have to go through and figure out how do I break down these kids. And of course, Andover wouldn't rank and wouldn't give a GPA. So that I had to do calculations on all these kids looking at rigor of curriculum, in terms of what I would calculate as an estimated GPA. And I would actually create an order in terms of how the kids would fall in my mind. And I would draw a line at a certain point. Kid who would fall below that line better have some other reason why they jump up. A legacy, an athlete, a student of color, some incredibly impactful activity that you started something that just has made an incredible difference in their community. That would be the way to perhaps overcome being a little bit further down in the school group.
Got it. Michael, another question here. Does it make sense, in addition to the 2 teacher recommendations, to add in a letter of recommendation from an internship, or is that overkill? I'll address that first by saying it's got to be additive. If the letter of recommendation is only reinforcing what the admissions committee already kind of knows, I'm not sure what you have more friends. What are you actually showing there, right?
Yeah, if it's additive, a great example is a student who does an internship and helps that person write a paper, and then there's an abstract that they can submit with their application or with this additional recommendation that shows that. That's huge. Okay, so there are certainly additives that can take place that can make a difference to make you stand out. Yeah.
Cool. So Michael, I'm going to pull in one more last question from, all right, I'll take this as this will be the last question here. Does it make sense to send first choice letter to the top choice university for regular decision? So I guess this is sort of like if you're applying to say like USC, Michael, right? Mm-hmm. And they don't offer early decision or early actions, only regular decision.
Yeah.
Do you send a first choice letter? Thoughts?
You could send a letter to USC that says, if you had ED, I would have gone ED. That's to say how strongly you feel about that particular school. But I have to admit that I would be skeptical on first choice letters, because you could write the same letter to 5 schools. There's no guarantee that you're only writing that letter. I know we want people to be truthful and we want to be able to trust them, but there are a lot of skeptical admissions people out there that get a letter. That's why ED is your first choice letter. Okay, that's why if you had the opportunity with schools that had ED, to then turn around in regular right now, when you could have done ED at a particular school and say that, the school's going to say, why didn't you apply ED?
Got it. Hey, Michael, this is the very last question that just came in. It's specific. How should a student decide between holding on to a deferral from a school like Cornell and committing ED2 to another school like, say, Emory? Thoughts?
That's got to be their decision. There's no guarantees in terms of the fact that you're going to get off a deferral list or later on a wait list. And if there's a second school that you feel really strongly about, that you care about, doing the ED2 might make sense.
Beautiful. So Michael and I will say thank you for attending. This was a lot of fun for us to kind of dive into these numbers and really prepare for this webinar. We hope you found it helpful. By virtue of being a part of this webinar, you are eligible for a special discount on a strategy session, whether it's post-mortem on your early apps and thinking about kind of helping you kind of work through these questions for ED2 or for regular, or how to refine your strategy, or just anything else related. Just give us a ring and use the code EDGE15. If you've logged into the webinar, we'll know that you're eligible for it. But please reach out and let us know if we can help. And then here's our contact information again. If you need, Michael, are any parting thoughts or parting shots before we say adieu?
It would be very easy to feel sorry for yourself if you were deferred right now. What it is, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to look at some other options, but also to reinforce your application at the school that you were deferred at. And then to turn it into a negative and say, woe is me, is not the way to approach this process.
Very few people who, are coming from the context that the people are probably coming from who are watching these videos, they have a lot of magic in their lives. And, I'll say just to add that the fact that you got deferred is probably a testament to the work that you did to help you not get rejected. You're still in the game, right? The question is, what will you do with the opportunity? Happy holidays, Michael. Happy
Thank you,
holidays.
to everybody else as well. Yes, good.
Have a great holiday season. Be safe, be well, have fun, and good luck. If there's anything that we can do, let us know. All right, take care.